Okay, let's make a start. I'd like to welcome you all to the Institute for Government this evening. My name is Jo Casebourne and I'm a Programme Director here at the Institute, and delighted to welcome you to hear from Beth Noveck, who I will introduce properly in a minute. Meanwhile, just a bit of housekeeping. So we're not planning for any fire drills, so if that does go off, please follow myself and colleagues down the main stairs that you came in. And we would very much like you to join the conversation on Twitter. So the hashtag that we're using is OpenGov, and we'll be putting that up at the end of Beth's slides as well, along with our Wi-Fi details. So do tweet away on OpenGov. So firstly, I'd like to properly introduce Beth Noveck, who's here to talk about her new book, Smart Citizens, Smarter State. So Professor Beth Noveck is co-founder and director of the GovLab, and its MacArthur Research Network on opening governance. GovLab strives to improve people's lives by changing how we govern. So it does this by designing and testing technology, policies and strategies for fostering more open and collaborative approaches to strengthen the ability of people and institutions to work together to solve problems, to make decisions, to resolve conflict, and to govern themselves more effectively and legitimately. Beth's new book, Smart Citizens, Smarter State, The Technologies of Expertise and the Future of Governing, was published in November and is available here tonight for you to buy at the end, and I certainly very much enjoyed reading it. So in terms of the format for this event, after introducing Beth, I'm going to ask her to speak for about 20 minutes. Then we're going to pick up some of the themes together in the book before turning to you to ask for kind of questions and discussion and thoughts of how we can take these approaches into the UK government context. And here in the UK, we've also been thinking a great deal about the need for a smarter state. Indeed, it was the title of a major speech by the Prime Minister back in September, so very relevant to debates here. And in the book, Beth argues for the need for innovation in the way we do government, and particularly in the way we do policy making. And it really focuses in on how to design in citizen expertise into government. And Beth makes a strong critique of the historical professionalising of government, which she argues has led to a kind of false dichotomy between relying on a professional elite or a so-called ignorant citizenry. And the book talks instead about the need for policy making to reach out much more broadly and more collaboratively in something close to real time, and the need for new arrangements that are both more participatory and at the same time more expert. And she also argues for the need for a better way to harness the power of experts both inside and outside of government. So we'll explore these themes in a bit more depth after Beth speaks, but first of all, I'm going to hand over to you to tell us more about the book.
Great,
Thanks,
thank
Beth.
you. And I want to thank Jo for having me, and I want to thank Carrie for making the arrangements to have me here, and also my colleague Stefan Verhulst in the back, if you'll wave, who is GovLab's Director of Research and otherwise the timekeeper. So I'm going to come down here because I think Jo has put forward the proposition about how we're going to take these things into government. The question is, should we in the first place? So I'm going to try to make the case to you that we should, and hopefully we can have some conversation about whether that's so, and if so, how. So as many of you know, I worked for the Obama administration at its outset. In the first 2 years of the administration, when Obama, as you know, on his very first day in office, signed the Memorandum on Transparency and Open Government, calling for a transformation in the way that we govern according to 3 values: transparency, participation, and collaboration. And some of that we've made really great strides on. And both here and in the US, we have made great advances in the move towards greater transparency, and particularly towards how we open up government data to put more data sets online, not only in our 2 countries, but of course now in over 60 countries around the world, where we have national government portals and lots of success stories to tell about the ways in which open data is helping government to work better, is helping to create jobs and promote entrepreneurship, and also helping citizens to make better choices. Where we've had less development, of course, is around the agenda, not of data.gov, but really what I would call people.gov. How we do engagement and how we make real those prongs of the agenda around participation and collaboration. So we have not really seen, I would put to you, a fundamental transformation in the relationship between citizens and the state. We're getting good at this data piece, but this part where we actually are engaging people in how we make policy and how we make decisions and how we solve problems is a lot less well developed. What we have done a good job of in terms of asking people what they can do for their country is asking them to share their opinions, right? So we have gotten good, whether it's through petitions in the UK or in the US, at asking people how they feel. Tell us what you think about an issue, and this has helped to bring to the fore what people care about in new ways than we've been able to do. But it is not, for those people who are policymakers in the room, we realize very helpful to how we do their jobs. Getting a naked suggestion that we should deport Justin Bieber back to Canada, or that we should build a Death Star, the two most popular petitions on the White House website, are not necessarily conducive to improving how you do your jobs and improving outcomes in education and healthcare and justice and creating jobs in the economy. And that is because we need to go beyond simply asking people what they feel, and we're beginning to use technology to do so, to asking them to share what they know and what they're actually able to do. So we're seeing new examples over the last few years of actually getting people engaged in doing tasks, in doing things, contributing their time and their know-how. Just this past November in Sao Paulo, they turned the concept of civil service training on its head, and instead of having civil servants getting trained within professional civil service training institutes or coming to a place like the Institute for Government, they said to citizens, we know less about technology and innovation than you do. Why don't you teach us? And they created the open government, the Sao Paulo Aberta School, and asked citizens to volunteer, they're getting paid, but to create classes to teach civil servants technology and innovation. And they've started to train now 24,000 people within the government in new topics in technology and innovation. This kind of engagement also looks like not just getting people to give of their time, but getting people to give of their ideas, right? So it's not just opinions, but you can go now on Madrid's website and give know-how and skilled advice about how to improve Madrid's or create Madrid's new transparency law. In Paris, I can share my ideas with the mayor of the city. So we're seeing lots of examples now of going beyond this, just asking people what they feel, to getting people to do things in new ways. I very much got my start in doing this work now quite some time ago by creating the first system for the National Patent Office in the US, and we piloted this in the UK and Japan and elsewhere, which was asking volunteer scientists and technologists within industry and with academia to help share what they know with national patent offices to improve the process by which we examine patents. So recognizing that the best information not only sits within the bureaucracy, but is widely distributed out there, we developed a platform and a system to get people to share their know-how. Fast forward a few years to 5 years ago, and the US government rolls out challenge.gov, the prize-backed challenge platform, drawing, of course, on the famous Longitude Prize from Britain, and now 450 federal agencies have posted challenges asking citizens to do not the simple thing of saying what they feel about Justin Bieber or the Death Star, but to come up with hard and winning solutions to how do we remove salt from saltwater to improve farming. How do we reduce the word gap between the number of words a rich and a poor child hears before the time he or she is 5 years old? Hard problems which people have the know-how to solve. And of course, now we're seeing evidence of similar work going on in Europe. Just last month, the European Food Safety Agency closed a tender calling for better strategies for crowdsourcing expertise, not opinions, about how to improve reduce the risk of foodborne illness and improve food safety. But there's a challenge. There's a challenge to the way that we've been doing things that I would argue is fundamental to the reason why we don't see a radical transformation. And that is the problem of the open call. When we ran Peer-to-Patent, we had to spend all our time on marketing, if you will, on letting people know about the opportunity to participate. Last week, I was talking about citizen engagement at 2 major research universities, at an engineering faculty and at a law faculty. And I asked the students there, smart Ivy League students with all the advantages in the world, how many people had been on challenge.gov? Not a single hand had gone up. Nobody had even heard about it, despite the fact that I was sitting in a place where people had the know-how to contribute to making government work better. So we have this idea that smarter government can come, not just from data, and I want to recognize the amazing work that Paul Maltby has been doing in helping to bring more data into government and more evidence-based policymaking and the greater use of data to deliver policy and services, but how we do that also from citizens. And that's hard because it is about finding the needle in the haystack, finding the expertise that we need. It's hard because we are not used to, in the culture of government, asking a question and admitting the fact that we don't know. So if you're a programmer, you go on Stack Exchange along with millions of other people and you post a question which says, how do I find the line of code that allows me to do X, Y, and Z? But if you're in government, it's really hard to post a question, not only because it's antithetical to our culture, but also because what are you supposed to say? How do I reduce the backlog in veterans' benefits claims? How do I reduce the disparity in pay between men and women? It doesn't quite have the same level of granularity that lends itself to posting on Stack Exchange. How do we also increase the alacrity and the agility with which we're actually able to get expertise? So whether it's in Europe or in the States, the traditional way we do this is through the formation of advisory committees, right? So there are other vehicles as well, but just simply put, in the interest of time, we have both here and there 1,000 of these committees with 65,000, 70,000 people who serve on them. But if you take one example in our Ministry of Education, the advisory committee that's tasked with solving all of the issues around the financing of higher education has 11 people on it. And those 11 people have served on this committee with some change up since 1986. That is not exactly, and there's good reason for it, I might add, because we have these structures in place to ensure that these committees will be balanced in terms of representation, will be free from undue influence, will be transparent in the way that they work. But it's not the same as what I can do with a Stack Exchange, where I can post a question and get an answer in 3 seconds. And where if I come along later with the same question, I can type it into Google and find an answer. There's got to be a way of moving from the world of the open call, in which we do not get our expertise that we need, to the world in which we can actually do a better job of targeting the expertise that we need to solve problems. And I would say there is no more important opportunity for us today than to think about engagement not as a mass-based exercise of asking people what they feel, but to one in which we can actually imagine a world where we can find people who have the know-how that we need. So that when we have an emergency, and think about the Zika virus today, I can find the people who have expertise in dealing with a pandemic, or who've lived in Brazil, or who know something about neurology and microcephaly, where we can find the people who can do either the tasks that we need and provide the skilled know-how, or can provide the credentialed know-how that allow us to get answers to questions. This is, to put this in another way, something very familiar to everybody in business who thinks about the concept of audience segmentation, right? So if I am a marketer, if I sell toothpaste, I spend an awful lot of money on understanding when you are likely to buy toothpaste. You probably know a lot about how to get people to buy toothpaste. That's why you're successful. And the question is, how do we actually do more of that, both with citizens, but also with the civil service? And so both in Britain and in the US, President Obama, in unveiling his budget last week, and of course in myriad evolutions of the civil service reform plan here in the UK, there has been an emphasis in looking at what are the new strategies for segmenting our audience, first with the civil service, and then I would argue also eventually with citizens as well. So I want to just close with giving you a couple of examples of the ways in which we are beginning to do this, what some people call people analytics. We are using data to tap into what people know and to match the demand for that expertise. When we have the need for a doctor, HealthTap provides the supply of that doctor, right? So if I'm a middle-class mother and my child has a sniffle, I can pay 99 cents and go on HealthTap and get a doctor. And they're similarly doing this now for crises in the developing world. But what it's allowing us to do is to use technology to target what people know. This is not a conversation we could have had 10 years ago, that we could have had 20 years ago. It's one that we can have today thanks to the evolution in technology that's allowing us to make more searchable and more findable the know-how and expertise that we have. So now, right, I can go on LinkedIn, as 250 million other people do, and post my credentials, and you can find them. So you can know that I have a law degree and some other degrees and whatever else it is that I've done. But I can also make manifest and searchable not just my credentials, but also my experience. So maybe I've written some code and I've posted a repository of that code on GitHub, or maybe I've actually won a contest, or maybe I won't go into the details of the work of Panos Iperotis, but it's fascinating work that demonstrates that people who have passion and interest in a specific topic, the kind of people who search on healthcare websites, turn out to also have a lot of expertise about these topics. So there are lots of ways now that we can make searchable and we can find what we know. So I want to skip, and those are not just credentialed forms of expertise, diplomas and degrees, but they are becoming more granular evidence, digital indicia, sometimes called badges, of what we know and can do that we can make searchable. So if I go to NYU's School of Professional Services and I take a degree in film production, I get a badge. And that badge I can post online and you can search for it. So that is enabling, again, not only me to show what I know, but you as a manager, as a decision maker, as somebody running an institution to be able to search for it. So let me, So we can start to think about, and this is where I want to wrap up, is with a few examples of the way in which we are just beginning to be able to do more targeted searching, call it crowdsourcing wisely, what people within the civil service know and citizens know, again, sometimes based on credentials and sometimes based on experience and boots on the ground. It's essentially taking the idea that we know well from business in terms of customer segmentation, and we know even better from dating websites like Tinder or Match.com or any one of those, which is the ability to match people, right? That's what makes dating websites so successful. So what we need to think about is how do we do dating between government and citizens? How do we do dating? How do we match those needs and those questions with the people who have the credentials, the experience, and the passion to help? The Department of Defense, this is a project that has phased out and now been replaced, started a project about 5 years ago to use new data analytic capacity to actually track what the know-how is of people within the Department of Defense. So that instead of the opaque titles of manager and secretary and undersecretary and deputy this and that, you could actually find out who had experience flying the Apache helicopter and who would have the know-how that you needed to solve a problem. That original project has gotten phased out, but the new Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who started just a few months ago, announced on his very first day in office that in fact he was going to be launching a new Office of People Analytics and spreading this idea to all of the DoD so we could better do a job of networking what people know and can do. In our health ministry, we face the challenges every health ministry does of how do we efficaciously and quickly examine medical devices and drugs, get them to market quickly, but still protect lives. That has to be done by civil servants, and yet those devices are increasingly complicated. They're not just stents and plasters now, so they're apps and they're 3D printed tissue, this and that. And so what they're doing is instituting a people analytics platform to enable them to search now not just within the one agency that has responsibility for this task, but across the whole of the health ministry and its 110,000 employees to find the people more quickly to allow them to staff those teams and do a better job of examining devices. This is not just, though, about looking for credentialed expertise, like who has the right medical degree or public health degree. It's also about getting boots on the ground, getting at what people's experiences are and what they know. So platforms like Novak, the social network for the Latin American and Spanish-speaking world that tries to track, again, the experiences and passions of civil servants. Or in our environmental ministry, the project marketplace that is not about targeting people on the basis of their credentials, but rather posting projects and inviting people across the whole ministry to collaborate on them as a way to improve professional development and improve the outcomes of those projects. The World Bank, just this year, unveiled its new Skill Finder platform. 27,000 employees, alumni, and consultants now all in a common place where they can hopefully do a better job of targeting that expertise to achieve the goal, which is to reduce poverty, right? But a platform by itself isn't going to work. So what do? Is they open up just last month a help desk so that you can call the help desk and find a broker who's going to help you target and find the people with the right experience, the person who's put in a well in a particular country or knows about groundwater in another country to help you solve the problem that you're facing. So let me just wrap up. I'm going to by talking a little bit about two or three examples of the ways that we're beginning to do this with citizens. That's more government, that's Canada, that's New York. And if you want, and I'll just put in a plug for all the examples that I don't get to talk about today, we've put some of them up online on the Smarter State website, and also here we'll give out some stuff about this. But we're beginning to be able to do this kind of audience segmentation also for citizens. Right, so there's the AgriVivo platform that is the expert network now for agricultural experts around the world, growing out from universities into industry, but allowing us to tap into that credentialed expertise, but also lastly, into that boots on the ground know-how. Bill Gates in his New Year's letter that he and his wife put out every year said, we're going to invest this year in the creation of a global database of citizen expertise to tackle the problem of global poverty. And we're seeing, concrete evidence of how to do this in practice. In the US, we have 1,400 communities on the platform called PulsePoint. What PulsePoint does is target a single skill, my ability to perform CPR, so that when someone, God forbid, has a heart attack and the 999 call comes in, the geolocated text message comes to me and says, there's someone near me having a heart attack, and I can rush to their aid and perform bystander CPR. What does that look like? Well, when government performs the service in California of delivering emergency first response, these are the medics and the fire departments, et cetera, who can provide that service. This is what that coverage looks like when citizens get involved in the co-delivery of that service. And now, of course, this idea has come to London 4 months ago with the launch of Good Sam, provided by the London Air Ambulance Service, that is helping us to target specific know-how. So what I'm hoping we're going to talk about now in our conversation is the strategies for how we get from here to there. There are a lot of things we need to do in terms of creating the legal frameworks that allow us to do this, both getting rid of laws that get in the way and creating the platforms, whether they're systems of credentials or whether they are new kinds of expert networks that are actually allowing us to make expertise more findable and searchable. So let me just, I want to end, because we're going to talk about a lot of this, I think, in the discussion. Let me just end by saying fundamentally what this is about is not just changing how we make decisions and solve problems by enabling us to target what people know and can do. It's ultimately about transforming our conception of citizenship, right? From one in which citizens are passive watchers of those who govern, who can do no more than share their opinion and thereby vote the bums out of office, to one in which we are co-participants and active participants we're active participants in that process. Jürgen Habermas, the great father of participatory and deliberative democracy, has been complaining of late that the big challenge is that in Europe we don't build enough legitimacy by engaging citizens. We see this dichotomy between technocracy, right, good outcomes that are produced by civil servants, and legitimate participatory processes where citizens are engaged. The challenge is that he sees this antinomy, this difference between what citizens can do, which is what they feel, asking people what they feel, and successful outcomes in policymaking. Instead, technology helps us to combine these two. We can have both legitimacy and effectiveness when we use tools to allow us to target the expertise that makes engagement productive as well as legitimate. So let me stop with that, and I'll come back up here.
Great, thank you so much, Beth. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Let me turn this off.
Some really great examples as well, I think, for us to learn from in the UK context. What I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes picking up some of the themes that you touched on there and some of the themes in the book. And perhaps to start by thinking about citizen engagement. So you discuss in the book, and you've just outlined here, the kind of limitations of that traditional crowdsourcing model where you kind of go wide but not necessarily deep in terms of expertise. And you've highlighted the limits of e-petitions, and instead you're arguing for the need for that kind of constant ongoing conversation with an engaged, diverse and knowledgeable public. And certainly the work that we've done here, led by my colleague Emma, has shown that currently in the UK, public sector organisations are not currently set up to hold those kinds of ongoing conversations, which you were just touching on. And that can mean they commission engagement too late, or engage on kind of one-off issues, or not really on that kind of more continuous conversational basis that you talk about. So in some ways you could argue they're not kind of organisationally ready to use engagement to its full effect. So interested in whether you kind of agree with that premise, and if so, how do we in UK government context kind of change and adapt to prepare for a very different way of talking to citizens?
So absolutely, we do not have the institutional capacity to create those ongoing conversations, and why should we? Why should we, frankly? We have too many things to do, the problems we face are too hard, there are not enough hours in the day, and when you ask me to layer on top of my already difficult job the traditional practices of doing listening sessions or asking people for their opinion or trying to, so we are used to doing some of the window dressing of convening the various interest groups that we need to in order to buy legitimacy around a policy. But the challenge is twofold. One is we're not viewing the opportunities for engagement, we're not viewing that concept of conversation broadly enough. Mm-hmm. In other words, this is not about talking to people how they feel just before you implement a policy to build legitimacy. It's about looking at the full arc of the decision-making process and looking at every stage, what is the know-how that I need in order to help me do a better job, and how do I target that know-how in order to create a more productive outcome. So that's not, let me be clear, not to the exclusion of inviting broad-scale participation, and not to the exclusion of having open fora for comments and for engagement. But if we're not thinking about how do we reduce the cost of making an engagement part of the daily cost of the daily way we operate, it's always going to be a nice to have instead of a must have. Mm-hmm. If I'm a programmer, it's not a nice to have to go on Stack Exchange. It's where I go to solve my problems. I need the line of code that allows me to get on with my day, but that allows my program to run. And every other industry has a concept of knowledge management that is designed around productive forms of knowledge exchange to solve problems. Mm-hmm. But in government, we have a lot of legal, cultural, and other and technical impediments that make it very hard for us to do that. And fundamentally, what's at the root of that is the view that citizens are not going to participate well, right? They lack cognitive capacity, they lack time, all they're going to do is yell at me, they're going to criticize me. But when we get away from from thinking about it only as a referendum on people's opinions, and instead we start to think about the London Air Ambulance example and say, what I need is somebody who can perform CPR. What I need is somebody who knows how to crunch this data. So if I'm British Columbia now and I'm trying to improve the delivery of citizen services, I'm going to the BC Developers Exchange to go and find on the network of software developers there people who can help me better improve the delivery of digital services. There are lots and lots of ways that we can engage people, and it doesn't all look like the conversation in the sense of a group of citizens sitting in a church basement having a dialogue. Those are the things that are hard and time-consuming and hard to do well, but they're not the only form of conversation or way to engage with people.
That's really helpful, and I think you talk quite a lot in the book about the White House Open Government Initiative and how you tried very different mechanisms to generate those kinds of ongoing conversations. What were some of the kind of key successes and failures from that we could learn from in the UK, so we don't repeat any mistakes, or so that we can learn from success?
That's what history is for, repetition, right? So I think challenge.gov has been a tremendous success story for a variety of reasons. Challenge.gov has been, at its essence, again, a recognition that there is that expertise, it's widely distributed, you can ask people to do hard things. It also has been, frankly, an end run around procurement. What challenge.gov was to create a legal mechanism to ask people to contribute know-how and expertise rewarded by the incentive of a prize as an alternative to a traditional procurement process. So we both reach more diverse audiences, get potentially better solutions, save money, work in a more agile, faster way. The failing, if you will, has been one of marketing. Another great success story is, of course, the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, which has spawned, very much copied, I have to say, inspired by the idea of the government digital service here and the notion that we should have smarter, better techies who work in government, and we didn't have a way initially to stand up a GDS. We wanted to do that in the first place, but the easier thing for us to do first was to create these fellowship programs. So we would parachute innovative people in to work with civil servants on innovative projects. And then from there, we built a culture that allowed us now to build our own version of government digital service and what's sometimes also called the office known as 18F. And now to build those fellowship programs, not simply in a high-profile fashion in the White House, but in every ministry at the state and local level. You're seeing lots of copying of this model, the idea of creating more of a diffusion of talent between the public and private sector, between universities and NGOs and government, again, as another form of engagement. So it doesn't all look like the conversation in the church basement or the comment session or the listening session. It's about getting people to go to hackathons, getting people to do a year of fellowship, getting people to answer a challenge on challenge.gov. It's about responding to the call from the President of the United States now to, who has said we're going to deliver computer science education to every student in America. We're not going to do that from the White House. We have no mechanism to do that. What we can do is to call out the engagement opportunity and use our convening power and the inspiration that we can give to get lots and lots of people engaged in and participating in new ways. So I think where some of the successes, and we may not have even recognized them as such, is in beginning to create a multiplicity of engagement opportunities. But it by no means has become institutionalized in practice, in part because of legal and cultural impediments that still make it very hard for us in government to say we do not know and we need help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think picking up on some of that around the kind of role of technology in harnessing expertise, you talk a lot in the book about how technology is just changing the game with peers rating each other, the badges examples that you showed us, and new ways of kind of showing credentials online and recommendation mechanisms and those kinds of things. In particular, you highlight the expert networking tools and the commitment that the US government has made to expert networking, which I thought was really interesting in the Open Government Action Plan in the US. So I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about how that might work or about the experts.gov example.
In fact, may have been in the footnote. So I'm gonna test your careful reading here. It was in our initial action plan to have, I worked on this project, we nicknamed it the experts.gov project. And in fact, there is so let me say two things. It was in the action plan, and then it got taken out of the action plan when someone realized that it was actually illegal to go ask citizens a question under various statutes that exist. So it is currently illegal to go out and get expertise in the kinds of ways that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So it was in the action plan, taken out of the action plan, nobody noticed. Shh, don't tell anybody. But it has been brought back under the same name, and so the commitment thereby fulfilled through the project I mentioned at the Health Ministry, at Health and Human Services, to tap into experts within government to better staff medical device and drug review panels, something which is done again by civil servants and for reasons of conflict of interest cannot be done by law with the general public. But there has been this shortcoming in how do we find the people who know stuff, even in government, mm-hmm. to do things, it's not so simple, but to do the task of examining a medical device. And so that has been brought back under the name experts.gov and refers to the tapping of expertise among civil servants. And now the Health Ministry is again looking at, which has responsibility for things like the influx of undocumented children coming across the border from Latin America without unaccompanied and undocumented children, responsibility for their welfare. How do we better organize the capacity within the civil service to help those children? So this is very much about both credentialed expertise and let me call it kind of experiential expertise and trying to redesign how we staff teams, how we curate expertise and put people together in order to solve problems.
Fantastic. And you also make a recommendation for what you describe, I think, as a 21st century brain trust, based on the one that advised FDR in the New Deal. And you describe that as a kind of online community of practice, so a platform to match people with expertise with people who need that expertise. And I was interested in your approach to saying that that itself should have inbuilt experimentation, so we can actually learn over time on how these kind of participatory governance models might work. So can you tell us a little bit more about that idea?
So two quick sort of reflections built into that. Again, drawing on the experience that you have pioneered here in the UK through David Halpern's work with the Nudge Unit, and beginning to build sort of more of a culture of experimentation into how government makes policy, is the idea of more experimentation, not in the choice between policies, but in the mechanisms by which we do this work. So one of the things we have yet to do, we're just at the beginning of trying some of these techniques, is we need more experiments about what works. So when the health ministry reaches out to employees to change how it staffs medical device review panels, we can measure, does that work better? Is it faster? Does it get us more diverse know-how? Are the medical devices that are examined in this way less likely to be recalled, less likely to kill people? All of those things are things we can test. Can we compare, for example, two different ways of doing this? The Environment Ministry doesn't want to go search for civil servants. They do not like this idea that we should look for what you know and therefore curate teams. They think this is somehow, they think there's a certain unfairness to that, and they prefer the approach of posting the project and letting you self-select to participate in the project. So we need to compare, is the way the Environment Ministry is doing things or the way the Defense Department is doing things, which of these is going to work better and in which context? So number one, I think is important, and this is something we have learned very much from you, and that I think can be brought, we can bring back and forth across the pond, is how we introduce more experimentation into the techniques by which we actually do the work of problem solving and decision making. So I think that's, but now I think I didn't answer the second half of the question. Just remind me what that was.
Just on the idea of the brain trust.
Oh, the brain trust, yes, the actual practical implementation. So anticipating the criticism, which is, okay, this is all well and good. You want to talk about tapping into better expertise, but how are we actually going to do this in practice? So I have devoted a large chunk of the book. This is a teaser to get you to want to read that. To get to the second half, the preface is pretty good, but I do recommend reading past the first 5 pages, because I try to answer the question of how to do some of this in practice and what that could mean. Working out again from universities, where we have a lot of data about what people know, thanks to citations and publications, thanks to existing platforms, many of which have been built here, research networking tools that allow us to understand both credentialed and experiential expertise in universities and then also within industry, how we might take advantage of those networks in order to allow us to target those questions. So what we're going to see more of also is as private industry, as private industry begins to demand more evidence of skills and more digital indicia of skills in order to match people, employees to jobs, that same infrastructure, those same digital badges that are going to help me to find a job are going to also allow us potentially to make that expertise searchable for civic purposes as well. Mm-hmm. So universities already do quite a bit of this for different reasons. Industry does a lot of this kind of knowledge management and HR sorts of stuff, this sort of new digital people analytics work, for reasons of better matching employees. But as we build up this infrastructure, it's going to allow us to better tap into that. And the brain trust idea is simply, to steal that historical term, is what that means when that infrastructure gets married up to how government does its work. It's just about the idea of actually starting to push out problems, to curated networks of people, and to get know-how in more productive ways to allow us to work, hopefully where engagement is actually helping us to work better and faster, not slower and harder.
Okay, so I have a final question for you before opening up to the floor for everyone else's questions. What do you think are the main kind of 1 or 2 lessons that we should take from your book for the UK civil service and for UK policy making?
So there is a tremendous, I want to think about whether this is, what's the UK? The UK specific context is that of course, even as all of the focus is relentlessly about Europe and its future, immigration and its future, jobs and its future. I'm speaking to the converted if I say that a focus on the machinery of how government works, this is hardly an audience I need to tell this to, right? Still matters and is incredibly important to allow us to solve those very hard challenges. So it is not it's not that because we have to solve climate change, we can put this on the back burner. This is the way that we tackle the challenges of climate and Europe and whatever else are the pressing and burning issues of the day. And the point is that for too long, engagement, I mean, this is sort of Habermas's point, in the interest of being more efficacious in government, we put the issues of legitimacy and citizen engagement on the back burner. And that's because he has no practical strategies or examples for how you actually use engagement to deal with those hard problems, right? It's a nice to have. I'm paraphrasing here. And the point is that I think in order to tackle these very hard problems, which are only going to get more difficult, in an environment in which you have the top research universities in the world, more Nobel Prize winners in medicine than anywhere in the world, you know, there's all kinds of, we've got a lot of smart people on this island, right? And they're not only on this island, they're all around the world, who when posed a hard question with the right mechanisms for asking, will actually participate. And I think the focus and interest on civil service reform, the interest in finding ways to work in a more data-driven way and with fewer resources, frankly, the challenges, economic and otherwise, that are confronting us here and there on the other side of the pond, are actually create the pressure for innovating in how we do this. And that means looking within the civil service and also to citizens to tap into what people know and to organize that expertise more effectively.
Great, thank you. So lots of food for thought there. I particularly like the term people analytics as well, but I'm going to open it up to the floor. So please can you wait for the microphone and say your name and organisation, and keep your comments brief. And if you are sitting in the room next door, please do come through to ask a question. And I think I saw a hand at the back to start with.
And they can be questions or suggestions or stories or examples or things that you're hearing or
absolutely
disagreements.
And then there's a second question here. We might take two together and then come back to Beth.
Hello, Karin Christensen. The agenda you're setting out is actually profoundly challenging for civil servants in terms of their expertise, their investment, their knowledge base. And and the experience we've had with GDS here is an example. In the end, the civil service rejected that challenge. What do we do about that? What your experience of having done it on the inside? Because we know digital by default, and what this means for the nature of the state is we have to get there, but it's profoundly scary. How do we speed up this learning, this process, and your reflections on that?
And Paul?
Paul Maltby, I'm Director of Data now in Government Digital Service, so thank you for saying nice things. I appreciate that. On the data side, I think it's a really important agenda, but I think if there's one thing, for all the 1,001 things we need to get better in government and the niggles of government, it's like in 10 to 15 years' time, this will be the thing. It's this agenda that actually matters, which I think is the next profound change in government for my money. Two quick reflections. One is about the engagement and collaboration side of what you say. I think that there's lots of quite practical examples out there from UK government perspective, so things like Open Policy, blog.gov.uk, and on Civil Service Quarterly, a growing number of examples of collaborative practice brought into policy making. But it's really those spaces, things like, I think of Casserole Club from FutureGov, actually Dementia Friends in a funny way. Those where you're talking really about a participatory shift, where there's a shift in power and the very foundations on which those services are built. I think we're still yet to see it scale, and I think that's a really, the way in which you bring that stuff out is, I think, really important. The other reflection is about back into government and how we organise and think of ourselves as professions and communities within government. And I still think we do think about that in a very sort of quite traditional way. But there are glimmers of change in there. A few weeks back, there was GovCamp, right? So a few, you've been along, I think, previous ones. We have Open Data Camp on next Thursday. I've got the technical architects across government coming around and talk about on the data side in an unconference format. And often these things are a Saturday, the people coming together because they want to come together, bottom-up, self-organise. But it's really noticeable to me that we don't have the equivalent in the policy community and in all those other communities of government. And I think there's something about just the internal mechanisms of how we think of ourselves as civil servants in the system that actually needs to go through that shift. So I think it feels like we increasingly got sophisticated government on the internet in our pockets, but I don't think we've really understood what government that reflects on what the internet is and what it means for us. We still yet to make that step.
Mm-hmm. Beth.
So let me. I think to the point that this is your point, Karen, that this is profoundly scary. Yeah, so that's I hear that echoed all the time, right? Change is scary, and really we have invested 100 years in building up a set of processes, a set of structures that were designed against a very different informational environment, to your point, Paul, about embracing what the internet is and what it can do, right? We, people in public service, we do our job despite what anyone else might say, with the intent of stewarding the public trust as well as we can, to be the independent arbiters of expertise and information, to be the repositories of due process and fairness, and we have built up all of these structures that were designed in order to enable that. The challenge, though, is, of course, we have these, and I think that very much the way in which we have practiced and talked about citizen engagement only reinforces that fear. Because when engagement is about yelling at me and criticizing me and telling me that I'm doing a lousy job at my work, of course, there is a very little incentive to engage. But it's at the edges where we've started to open up data and then invite geeky people to come and build apps around it that we say, oh, people will show up on a Saturday and will collaborate in productive ways. So what the hackathon has done is not transform government. What it's given us a model of is ways in which we can co-create and productively produce solutions to problems together. And so it's in that sort of tech space that we've seen the first evidence of that, but it's starting to come, and I think it can come into these other spaces, and in particular, if we start focusing first on civil service expertise and how we organize it differently, not just on citizen expertise. So take, for example, the deep desire now to do more evidence-based and more data-driven work within government. And yet we have very limited capacity in terms of people whose title is analyst or statistician and surely big data person. And yet there's a lot of distributed analytic capacity throughout government organizations and institutions, right? People have it because it's how they were trained in their degree programs, it's because it's part of their job, they're not part of their title. And if we have tools, we may be able to find different ways of tapping into that. So one of the projects actually that Paul was instrumental, you're getting another shout out here. You have the misfortune of sitting in the second row, so you're getting picked on, but only in positive, nice ways, hopefully. Is a project that we have been looking at together, which is how do I do a better job of identifying and visualizing and making searchable civil service expertise so that if we want to do things like spread the ability to adopt an innovation like open data or crowdsourcing or pay for success or social impact bonds, I don't have to just go to Paul to ask that question about how do I do that. We can network the people across civil service organizations who have the know-how about how to do that and who may have done it in practice or who may in turn know other people who've done it and can help us find what we need to know. And so that's where the really, I think, interesting and successful examples are that are less scary, are the ones in which it's about making faster, cheaper, and easier the ability for us to answer the questions that help us to do our jobs better in the end of the day. And that's where I think in terms of changing the culture, we have to start with those, the ones that are less scary, and then we kind of build out from, there. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I hope that was a little too long. And
that's very helpful. It reminds me of some of the kind of behavioural insight teams' approaches of kind of starting small and then using that to kind of get wider culture change. There was a question right at the back and then one here, and then we'll come back to those two in front. So we'll take those two first.
Oh, hi, my name's Sukhvinder Kaur Stubbs, and I was particularly interested in what you had to say about fostering a culture of experimentation. And you mentioned the What Works centres. I suppose one of the things that I'm aware of is that a lot of what works is circumstantial and very much dependent on, the area, the opportunities and so forth. And I'm wondering to what extent data technology is actually being used to take the specifics of what works in any area and actually systematize it so that you can apply it more widely.
And then the second question was just here.
Hi, my name's
Should be on.
my name's Tom Wills. I just wanted to reflect on what I thought was perhaps a risk of one of your key themes, which is the distinction between crowdsourcing widely and crowdsourcing wisely. And you recognise that, especially for civil servants, the way we've tended to make policy is in a narrow way that has not been as collaborative as you might like. And my worry is that when we talk about crowdsourcing wisely and finding kind of expertise that we understand, we then lose the potential of involving people who maybe just have a kind of, maybe don't have expertise but have just one idea. And we lose that kind of democratizing power of the information technology and communications that we've got. And whether the idea of crowdsourcing wisely then is allowing civil servants to remain within their kind of comfort zone.
So let me start backwards, because I'm very glad that you asked that, because both questions are excellent, but it's something that I had wanted to talk about. One thing to recognize is that this is about improving also on the current state of where we are today. So if you think about how you do your job, which I assume might be in the policy space today, I'm guessing, I'm loath to use the word Rolodex, since I've discovered that people under a certain age don't actually know what that is. And I don't know if my students actually, I say Rolodex and they look at me like, what is that? And that may not carry over across the pond either. But essentially, there are the core group of people that you anyway talk to, right? So I've had people work for us at GovLab. We had last year a wonderful young man, was a Senate staffer, tasked with writing the bill on a bill on youth homelessness, right? So this is a kid who has a roof over his head and always has, and so he has 3 days in which to craft national legislation. And we had another guy who worked for us, you'll recall, who was in the National Economic Council and who was tasked with writing America's policy on small business ownership. He was about 23 years old and he'd never owned a business, let alone started a business. I think he'd probably been in a business, but that was the extent of his expertise. And so the way we constantly have these pressures and challenges to cover a wide diversity of issues, and so how do we get that expertise now, right? So part of this is we are working in ways that are the usual suspects, the usual interest groups, the usual lobbyists. And I say lobbyists in a value neutral word, in the sense that they're coming to present information often from a point of view, but that's how we get a lot of know-how. We pick up the phone and call the people that we know because they have a certain set of credentials, or the people who know the people whom we know, and that's often how things get done today. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that crowdsourcing more wisely and moving to more of a brain trust model should be to the exclusion, again, of, it doesn't mean getting rid of the open call. But it sure as hell would be great if the Department of Education, instead of having 10 people on a committee that's advising, that provides the major source of expertise on how we're going to handle financing in higher education, a committee that has one student, one college president, one representative of this organization, that organization. Again, 10 people designed to represent social interest groups rather than to represent a diversity of expertise, one problem. But wouldn't it be great if we could have 100 students or 100 college presidents, or have better ways at least of making that somewhat broader and more diverse than we can do today? So I think one thing to recognize is the perfect is the enemy of the good here, and that we can do a better job that is, if it's too scary, You know, our friend in the back here is not going to, Katrina isn't going to let us do this, and people aren't going to say yes. So it's also thinking about what are the practical ways that we can get from here to there is by broadening how we do that, how we bring in expertise. And just to bring the point about data-driven decision-making and how we use data essentially to understand better what works, I wish we had, this is a topic we could spend many evenings on. So I won't do this one justice, but part of what's driving, I think, the interplay between the greater availability of data as a way to engage people with more expertise actually is an important part of the story. Because the access to data then creates the demand for people to scrutinize it, creates the demand for people who know how to analyze it, to visualize it, to make sense of it, to bring different approaches and hypotheses to that data. So I'll give you one example. We're doing some work now in the United States around innovation and reform in the criminal justice system, a topic which, you know, we're up there with China and Syria and the United States, right? We're Russia, China, Syria, and us. We're kind of vying for the top honors in most incarcerated people. So there is a bipartisan consensus that we need to fix this problem. There is a lot of, and there's a big question about how do we, and everybody knows the only way we're going to fix this problem is by having more access to data about which interventions actually work, right? So this is borrowed very much from the playbook here, and the challenges are how do we get access to that data, et cetera. So I think the interplay, it's not a story about data by itself. It's about creating the network of people with hypotheses about what interventions are going to work and bringing them together with the data. So it's a form of data-driven kind of targeted crowdsourcing, and that's partly what the Nudge folks have been good at and what Works has been good at. But it's data that's driving engagement. So that's a poor short answer to a very hard and interesting question.
So we have the next two questions are just here and here. We've got some more over here as well, and do come in from the other room if you'd like to ask a question. Can we just start with these ones?
Hello, my name is Siobhan and I work in local government. And I'm stressing the point local government because I'd like to ask you about how you bridge the gap between the civil service and the wider public service. Because the civil service as a unit in itself, which mainly designs and tries to deliver policy from Whitehall as opposed to public servants who are out in the field, have experience of what's happening in the real world, and as a result of which are seen as outside of government who is making the policy. So what views or experience have you got on bridging that gap? And I guess for me also the value of civil servants and public servants as well as being citizens, right, and tapping into that as well, because even though we might work for the public service or civil service, we live in the country, we pay our taxes, etc.
Yes. Yes and yes. Sorry, I'm supposed to take a few questions, and I do have a...
Okay, thank you. I'm Ian Boyd. I'm Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK Government on Food and Environment. I think what you've said actually resonates very strongly with a lot of the things that I see going on in government at the moment, and there's a lot of ambition there. I think the but I would put in is about quality control of the information that comes back. And I certainly work in areas where a lot of the evidence is highly contested. And some of that contest is around different factions bringing political views to bear on the evidence itself and biasing the evidence. I just wondered if you put any thought into, let's say, an underlying taxonomy of those types of issues that actually work well through a crowdsourcing type route, and those issues that might have to have a much more bespoke kind of methodology, as we have in science. Actually, we do already have some very strong methodologies to actually essentially crowdsource information in science in a reliable way. So is there an underlying taxonomy that you would say that some things actually work well as opposed to other things that actually don't work so well?
Should I do those two?
Yes, please, that'd be great.
Okay. So starting with the first one about local, so I think it just, first of all, yes, and that's part of the whole point of saying if we start with recognizing that public servants, civil servants, our citizens too, have a lot of expertise to bring to bear. I didn't have time to talk tonight before about an example coming out of Wales, not one that is a great success story yet, but it's an incipient success story in the borough of Torfaen, which is anybody from there? Been there? Know where it is? Oh, look, hooray. So have you heard of Wisdom Bank? No? Okay. See, not a huge success yet, on the up and up. So if you look at what they're doing there, which is to say a lot of the knowledge that you want and expertise is heavily local, right? It's not just about, yes, I can go on Facebook and learn about diabetes or dementia, but it's about how do I manage with diabetes or dementia in my community. It's about how do I start a business or get a job in my community. And so they've come up with this model which is very much about peer-to-peer, neighbor helping neighbor on a local level. And they're still trying to figure this out about what you can do better on a local network, on a local expert network rather than on a global one or a national one, where I'm not looking for the best scientists at Cambridge. What I'm looking for is the person in my backyard. What I'm looking for are the teachers and the doctors and the people in my community. And that's very much the London Air Ambulance example, right? It's about tapping into public servants, medical professionals who are distributed in the community and who have expertise to bring to bear. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for also getting frontline expertise, when forming a central policy about education, to be talking to teachers who are on the front lines, right? To be talking to, if you're forming a healthcare policy, to be able to talk to doctors and nurses. And so very much at length in this kind of brain trust example is very much about that. Is how do we do exactly that? And I think you have lots of people who want to participate productively and responsibly. To the point about what kinds of corruption that can lead to in terms of self-interested participation, there's obviously been a movement already in the sciences towards, number one, more open forms of peer review, even in science, right? The requirement of open access, of opening up underlying data sets, of more open peer review processes to reduce some of the problems that come from even traditional scientific peer review processes that I think we can draw lessons from here as well. So one is, again, to think about how we get an expertise at every stage of the decision-making process, and where bringing more transparency to those practices can actually help to improve quality control. When we did the work on peer-to-patent, that was very much about getting people to rate each other's contributions. Patents is a highly contested, there's a lot of money in patents, right? There's a lot of money because you have venture capitalists who care a lot about the patents that people have in their portfolio. And so when you had Microsoft giving information that they were using to defeat a patent application by IBM, it was very much self-interested, right? But it was transparently done, number one. And number two, the information that was requested was not asking people their opinion or their values or did you like this patent application. It was about asking people with a very highly structured taxonomy for certain kinds of information to prevent the gaming of the system. So the combination of asking people for very specific information and transparency. So in other words, the design of these processes can create ways of making them actually more reliable and less corrupt. In the end, and this is the bigger discussion, obviously we make a lot of decisions based on values, right? I can have all the data and all the evidence that I want, that the earth is round and the sky is blue, and I can still, be a politician who wants to make a decision that flies in the face of all of that evidence, right? So that is how we, but at least we can have more transparency about the willingness. If we have more of a record and more openness about how these things are done, then we can still make a decision. So that I think, and you will know more than I do about EFSA's move to try to bring more crowdsourcing to the food safety process, because because their decision about GMOs has been highly contested and viewed as potentially corrupt, and the closed door approach to getting scientific expertise has actually delegitimated what they've done rather than increased it. So I think we still don't know yet how to do these things as well as we might, but we know that the alternative is not necessarily better.
Great, and I'm going to go to a couple of people who did come in from next door to ask a question. So first of all here, and then just back here. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Irina Boluchevsky. I work for W3C and the Open Data Institute. and have a project around decentralization. So actually my question to some extent really follows on from the previous one, which is that I think expertise can rarely be completely separated from that kind of value judgments of how to solve a problem and also which problems should be solved. And I think all of this kind of engagement and really looking for expertise outside of government is really important. But how do we ensure that the right kind of questions and problems are set? So, like, for example, I care about privacy, security, and open standards, and there's a lot of ways in which better regulation and legislation could really help promote more sustainable applications, lack of lock-in, things that actually preserve people's privacy, or more collaborative and open business models, et cetera, et cetera. However, those things might get completely discounted because of the various political views and, the kind of pull of monopolies and the money. But there are lots of consequences to that path that I think people within the civil service are just simply not aware of. So they might not even be aware of the opportunities that might be missing out on, or the kind of future consequences of these actions, because there isn't the kind of political will to engage with that, and the expertise are missing. And I think that's like a serious kind of gap.
Mm-hmm. And then behind you, thanks.
Hi, my name is David Durant. I work for the Government Digital Service. Kind of a follow-on question about political will, really. You've spoken very well about civil servants collaborating with citizens and engaging at that level. But the reality is that high-level policy tends to be set while parties are in opposition, and has to be, because it has to be a platform that people can vote on before they come in. Right. When they discuss those policies while they're in opposition, it tends to be with academics and members of the public who have a very similar opinion to them. They're not motivated to go out and find people who might challenge them. How can we increase collaboration at that level before they even come into power?
Do you want to take one more?
Questions. Yeah, should we take, there was a few more from over here, so we take that one there.
I want to just listen. This is so, I have no answers to anything.
So we'll have to keep questions and answers brief.
It relates to these two questions, although I wasn't in the other room.
Do you mind saying your name and organization?
I'm Greg Parston. I'm from Imperial College. I am old enough to remember the Rolodex, and I'm old enough to remember Habermas, but I'm also old enough to remember Stephen Luke's and the third face of power. And there's a sort of a dark side to this. I think, what you're doing is terrific, but there's a sort of a dark side to this. And that is that you're engaging the citizen to do what you want them to do. And by so doing, getting them to think that that's what they should be doing. It's not about, you said very frequently that this is about getting people to help you think about how to do it. But isn't the bigger question what we should be doing? Maybe they don't want to work on Zika. Maybe they want to work on gun control. Maybe they don't want to work on criminal justice. They want to work on education. And that deprivation of people's voice from the questions about why and what, I think, are much more important when you talk about engagement than the question of how.
Three big
doing
questions.
One more.
Let's stick with that group for now.
Let's stick with that group. They're very much related. I'm the least dark person I know. I think I'm a Pollyanna at heart, but I think I have made unclear, or I have not done justice to the point that I think both of you make, which is essentially the ways in which we can engage people that all of you made around setting the agenda. Which is not just once I've already decided, it's not just about that end of the policymaking arc where I'm now deciding how to do the implementation or what are my possible solutions. It's identifying what the problems are that we want to solve. So I think these approaches very much lend themselves to those kinds of questions as well, number one. Number two, I think part of the whole point here is that right now we tend to view engagement very much as a one-size-fits-all process where we have a very limited set of ways for people to engage, and what we're seeing is, thanks very much to the use of technology, the ability to create many, many, many more forms of engagement that allow people to engage in the ways that they want to and that they choose, that speak to their interests and passions or their skills and their expertise. So the fact that I may want to work on an issue relating to the environment and you may want to work on education, I think the whole point is that we need to have the institutional capacity to create the long tail of participation. In other words, you know, that you should be able to work on what you want to work on, and I should be able to work on what I want to work on that matters to me and the ways in which I want to engage, rather than that one-size-fits-all, which is, I think, if you will, the dark reality. That's the reality of today. I don't think this is about moving towards, look, there are challenges to what I'm talking about in terms of new ways in which people will game these processes and new kinds of power relationships that this will invariably create. I don't want to be naive that we won't also, that this is not a constantly evolving challenge that we have to tackle. But I think right now we lack the opportunity to do the things that speak to what we care about and that matter to us. So when I go on challenge.gov and I see there's a problem to work on about remedying the word gap between rich and poor, first of all, no one's forcing me to work on that. There is a problem there, and I mean, the question is, to your point, is that forcing me to do that? I think one of the things, let me just layer into that, is another criticism, which you have not leveled at me, but I will level it at myself, is the question that often comes up is, where is the line between citizen engagement and citizen exploitation? Right, so you're asking me to participate, you want me to deal with this word gap challenge, you want me to solve the salt water in farming problem. Is that something, you know, should I be paid, should I not be paid? So that's also something that often gets asked, is where is that line where engagement becomes too much? So again, I'm gonna raise the question without fully answering that right now. The challenge.gov scenario solves it by actually offering monetary prizes for that problem, and by offering lots and lots of different ways for people to engage that speak to their talent and ability. What a lot of these people analytics platforms do is also are intended to create better professional development and greater satisfaction among government workers by creating new ways, new opportunities for working on things that you care about and that you want to work on, instead of being stuck in the same silo that you've been in. So that you can, at the EPA, work on a project on another part of the department that speaks to what you can do and want to do. So I think, you know, these are very, and I haven't fully answered the questions about politics, and let me just I will give short shrift to that one, which is unfair, but by saying that I focus on governance. I focus on what happens the day after the election. And if you lived in the United States right now, you too would be wishing it was the day after the election, at which point I will be perhaps looking for a job here. So that one, politics is blood sport. And I have no solution, but what I think it's about entertainment, and I'm not sure that making it, I think we should make it more entertaining. And my hope for our election is that there will be brokered political conventions, meaning we will substitute new candidates at the last minute, and it will be Jon Stewart versus Stephen Colbert will be the two-party candidates. And then we can worry about what happens, then the rest of us will worry about what happens the day after.
On that note, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So the good news is that Beth will be outside afterwards. Drinks. Come and join us for a drink. Beth will be signing books. But can you please join me in thanking Beth very much indeed for providing that.